turn off your camera or mute yourself, but also to your level of comfort, feel free to jump in with voice or chat as well. Just giving you a heads up that it's recorded so people can access it later on our website. Technology. So today's agenda, I'll start with introductions, share really the scope of the presentation, do a quick summary, and then provide time for Q&A at the end of the session. The other thing is that there'll be multiple places for folks to jump in via chat. I have some prompting questions, which I think are really beneficial for developing grant narrative or reporting narrative right now. And I'll be providing the answer for C2C in particular. But if you have something that you'd like to share from your perspective, you drop it in the chat. I'm able to see my chat over here as well. After I found it in the first session, now I can see my chat as well. So my name is Kelsey Zupke. I think most people know me, but my role is that of Director of Data and Research at Cradle to Career. So I provide some grant technical assistance, so helping programs and agencies write narrative, review narrative, and think about reporting. Prior to that, I worked at United Way, so I helped write RFPs and review grant proposals. And then way prior to that, when I worked overseas and in the Peace Corps, I was actually a part-time grant writer, just one of many hats that I wore working in nonprofits as well. So I've been on a couple of sides of the table. We have 3 individuals here who are going to be available and also to help me through chat. So Jeremy, if you would mind introducing yourself.
Yes, hi, I'm Jeremy Emmy. I'm the Community Impact Officer at Rochester Area Foundation. I coordinate our grant-making programs, our scholarship programs, and also our affordable housing programs.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Emily?
I'm Emily Johnston. I'm the Vice President of Community Impact at United Way of Olmsted County, and I oversee all of our grant-making.
Thank you. And last but not least, John? John was having technical difficulties in the previous session, so when he is able to jump back in, I'll provide some introductions time. So John Murphy is from Mayo Clinic Public Affairs, I believe, and so he's had provided some information from the Mayo perspective. So just as an icebreaker, they always say to tie your icebreaker to the content, and so I'm quite proud of this one, but sharing one thing that we have grown to appreciate about our work over the last 7 months. So when we're thinking about grant narrative and reporting narrative, it's really all about change. And within that change, there are some things that we've grown to appreciate as strengths of our organizations, agencies, or the staff within them. So I myself have really grown to appreciate Cradle to Career's flexibility, as well as our connectedness to a variety of community efforts. And so being able to participate in a number of different efforts and kind of have my role change pretty frequently is just something I've appreciated, not only about the organization, but also just about my job in particular. So if anybody else has something that they've grown to appreciate, feel free to jump in.
Well, Kelsey, I'll build off what you said and try to think of as many adjectives as I can for responsiveness. You got flexibility, adaptability, responsiveness, all of that would be, I think, the last 7 months have just brought that to a whole nother level. So I've really come to appreciate it. And yeah, and it's all empowered or enabled by an outstanding team.
Thanks, Jerome. Anybody else?
I guess I'll jump in and say I think I appreciate what has allowed United Way to be responsive, I think, is a learning mindset that we've really cultivated as an organization over the last number of years intentionally. And I think that has allowed us to move quickly and to make changes sort of on the fly as we continue to learn.
Thank you for sharing, Emily. And I also have in the chat from Annie some of the ways that we've been stretched and forced into doing things differently to find that different isn't bad. We've learned a lot and strengthened our resilience. And I feel that a lot of organizations are finding some kind of resiliency in how they have handled the changes as well. And so this is all to kind of prime us to think about change and how to bring story to that change and how to bring words to that change. So thank you for participating in the icebreaker. I wanted to start by kind of clarifying scope of this presentation. And I always like starting by what it isn't. It's not a silver bullet, so by attending this presentation, I don't guarantee that you'll be successful in all of your grant proposals or grant seeking in the coming year. It's also not one size fits all advice. So what might be true and appropriate for one organization or one funder might not be true for another organization and another funder. So it's not a super robust round of research into all possible scenarios. But what it is a quick summary of what we heard when we reached out to Rochester Area Foundation, United Way of Olmsted County, and Mayo Public Affairs. It's also a summary of what we have been learning through state and national networks, as well as a summary of what we've been learning by actually providing grant writing technical assistance to network partners. And a shameless plug is it's also an invitation to reach out to Cradle to Career staff for support in grant writing. Whether that's as an individual program or part of a collective effort, that is a service that we can provide to our network members. So I'll leave my contact information at the end of the presentation for you to do a reach out if that's what you want to do. So starting out with the bigger picture. So what funders are looking for in grant narrative. Sorry, every time I move my chat box, now it is on a different screen. So just wanted to start out, I heard in multiple places, in an environment where nonprofits are in great need of funding, in a lot of instances there have actually been fewer applicants than would be expected. So all of that to say is, like, don't take yourself out of the applicant pool prematurely. We're all busy and things are uncertain, but the playing field is level in that regard. So once in a while, I think maybe a program might think, well, I don't want to apply because I don't really know what shape this program is going to be in 6 months or what our services exactly are going to look like in 6 months, so I'm not going to apply. There's a lot of uncertainty, and all programs, all agencies are facing uncertainty, so don't take yourself up prematurely. It's always worth the effort. I also like to think, you know, a lot of people will ask, are we assuming COVID or are we assuming not COVID? And just the recommendation that I've been hearing is, like, make your assumptions clear and then make your case clear. Because funders only know as much as you do, right? Like, nobody has a crystal ball to know how long distance learning is going to be in effect, how long until the economy stabilizes, how long until XYZ. We don't know how far away any of the benchmarks are. So really providing examples like, for the duration of distance learning, we plan to do XYZ. Then as students return to school, we plan to do XYZ. So really explaining, like, which scenario you are thinking of, like what you would be doing under that scenario or under scenario A and scenario B. And just that clarity is all the more that one can provide right now. And some of the assumptions can be pretty unique because of the situation that we are in. And so feel free to drop in the chat some of the new, novel, or unique assumptions, or like if-then scenarios that you've had to make recently. From my own work portfolio, I really enjoyed this. I had a moment where we were project planning and we said, okay, school is starting in 2 weeks. If there is a schedule for classes, we are going to either lose our student volunteers or shift to 5 p.m. meetings. If we shift to 5 p.m. meetings, we're going to lose adult volunteers. But that bold part is like the assumption that we had to make, or like the planning space that we decided we were working in. If there is a school schedule, which I don't know prior to 2020, that would have ever been something that I would have to concern myself with. But when you have these really unique assumptions or contingencies that you're thinking about, just making it clear that this is the headspace that you're in, this is how you're thinking about the scenario currently. Continuing on, a lot of times applicants might feel like they're playing a game with unwritten rules, but an RFP like literally is the written rules. And so I always recommend, before taking yourself out of the applicant pool prematurely, like look at the eligibility requirements. Do you fit the eligibility requirements? If you have a question of whether something may be funded or not funded, always returning to that RFP for at least one more read through, because quite often the answer is in there. The funder has made every effort possible to make sure that it's really clear to applicants what the expectations are, what's eligible, what's competitive. So I always kind of encourage people to do that. Needs are increasing as the pandemic continues. So the need to be responsive, efficient, and collaborative has never been more important. So you're starting to see secondary and even tertiary effects from the pandemic as this continues. And so it might not be like a primary impact of COVID, like it might not be a health impact, but it might be secondary, like around employment or education. It might be like tertiary family stress, for example. But no matter what it is that you're doing, you want to be able to link your work to what you've observed or experienced are the needs in the community and other community conditions. And sometimes that will be COVID specific, other times not. Like I said, there's these like secondary and tertiary effects of the pandemic. So it might be a little ways downstream, or it might actually be from a like a different community need, but being able to say like, here's the community need that we observed, here's what we're doing about it. And a lot of times having to do that in a collaborative setting, because no one agency, no one program can address all the needs, especially as we've seen new needs appear in our workspaces. So another primer question is to think through what are some new collaborations you've participated in as a result of the pandemic. So from a C2C perspective, this would be work like the nonprofit consortium, taking on kind of a new role within whole family systems work, or taking on a bit of a stronger role in community schools over the summer, for example. And so this is all because of the current stresses on different agencies, different systems, being able to properly address the needs of students and families, and just being able to say like, here's the community need, here's what's needed to be addressed, here's the components, you know, that we did collaboratively, because no one agency can do it on its own. Another thing that's really occurring, because these new needs, or not new needs, but like increasing needs are showing up across the community, is being able to explain if there's been a prioritization of certain populations. So like, who are you serving and how are services designed specifically for them? So this is like another primer question is, how has your organization begun newly prioritizing certain populations? And an example would be families without internet to the home, or rural families. So a lot of times that comes down to geography. So prioritizing families or efforts based on geography might be new for your agency. So being able to explain like how that change has occurred, how it was observed in the community. And then moving into like how to describe COVID-19 responses in particular, all of those programmatic changes that have been made. I have like a set of starter questions, and I'll share the link to the worksheet here in a second. Is thinking about like, is this a permanent shift or is it temporary? How is it related to the original mission and vision? And then zeroing in on how is their program continuity. So what are the similarities to what was before? Are we serving the same kids? Maybe we're providing the same content or curriculum. Also, how has the program changed? So there might be new delivery, even though it's like the same students and the same curriculum, we might be doing everything virtual now. Maybe there's revised content because we look at our old curriculum and we say like, this is really not what's really highly relevant to students and their families now. So we'll bring in this new curriculum, for example. And there is a link to a handout, and I will share this with people in theory. Copy link address. And so if you click through and request sharing access, I can grant that to you later on, but it just like has captured all of these questions in one place. And so while as a grant writer, you might be able to go through and just answer these in your head, you're like, cool, great, like now I've developed the narrative, I know how to respond to this. I highly recommend doing it in a group setting, whether that's like in management group or a team setting, because working through some of these questions as a staff can be really instrumental in providing direction to the team, making sense of the changes that have come about during COVID, and then also like keeping forward momentum going. So while I'm providing the handout as a way to help think through writing narrative, I also encourage using it kind of as a team building exercise or a way to just like open conversation on some of these topics. And then while we have all of these questions about like, is the change permanent? Is it temporary? Something that I kept hearing was that lessons learned are highly appreciated. As a fundee or a grantee, it can always be like quite scary to say like, we tried to do this and it didn't work. But especially right now, like failure is not meaning that you're not going to get funded again. In fact, like this is how funders learn about what's happening in the community, what community needs are, and how agencies and programs are responding to those needs. And by learning about that, they can share those learnings and also adjust grants to help the community as much as possible. So while I always encourage people to be open and candid about the lessons learned or the failures that they've experienced, especially right now as the community conditions are changing quickly, like not being bashful about that, but being able to say like, here's what happened, here's how we responded to it, here's what we learned, and like here's what we're doing going forward, is not going to hurt you in the long run. And so as a starter question, I have like, what are some recent lessons learned? So from a C2C perspective, I wrote down like, even if you build it, they may not come. So like learning from our network partners, what their needs are, and how we might be able to support those needs. How do we make sure that network partners are being able to access those supports that we've developed? So kind of my secondary lesson learned is communications is not just about pretty colors and images like that, like social media, like large scale communications work, but also the really targeted outreach sort of work about like, here's what we do, here's what we're about, here's how you connect with us. And so I think as a team, like working through like, what are some things that we learned during COVID response can also help plan for the future as well. And then this is my favorite section. How to handle reporting when data and programs have been interrupted. I'm a data person, and so I really like thinking about data and demonstrating impact. The one thing right now is like our current moment in time is what made sense from a data perspective 6 months ago no longer makes sense right now, and what makes sense right now likely won't make sense in 6 months. And so I heard somebody refer to it as like the universal mulligan, like the data can kind of be all over the board. But what really matters is how you describe what happened to your data, right? So there could be a permanent pivot in terms of what you're offering as programming. So like, let's say that the program originally was all about college visits. Well, that just, it can't happen currently because of social distancing and restrictions and being able to transport students. But we have transformed a lot of that same content into like a virtual after school program. Okay, so you have like same kids, same basic content, but your delivery has changed. So maybe your old performance measures don't make sense. Like you can't report on the number of colleges that you visited, but maybe we need to update that performance measure to something like the number of colleges researched by students or something similar. Another way that your data can be interrupted is like an interruption to the actual data collection itself. But the programming is basically the same. So let's say that you were an after-school program. Now you're still an after-school program, but you're meeting virtually instead. So maybe initially you collected a lot of your data through small focus groups. Now that you're virtual, you just hadn't developed a way to do those focus groups virtually yet. So you don't have data at the year end of last year. So in that case, maybe the best way to address it would be to supply narrative around why that happened, and explain how you're going to collect that data in the future. So if the program is largely the same and the reason the data isn't there is because there wasn't time or maybe access to the students temporarily to collect that data, but here's how we might do it next year. We don't have to change the performance measures per se, but really just updating, here's what we're gonna do in the future as far as collecting the data. And so one of the first starter questions is like, what are some permanent changes your organization or your program has made? And I think this might be similar for a lot of agencies. From the C2C perspective, virtual options for participants, for example. Being able to participate virtually actually has increased participation for some things. And so being able to leave that as an option in the future seems to make a lot of sense for us. Another change that's likely permanent is like less focus on outcomes or achievement data, and more focus on systems data. So that might have started because there just wasn't outcome data. There wasn't year-end testing, for example. But as the systems change our organization, it makes a lot of sense to also look a lot at systems data about opportunity and access issues, and not just solely outcomes data. Jeremy is sharing that they also are looking at providing more virtual options as well, especially amongst groups that might have trouble traveling or joining during the day. I was like joking previously, it's like I used to spend like a half hour to 45 minutes driving to and from like a half-hour meeting, and being able to just kind of like call, and that becoming a social norm has facilitated some work. Another primer question is like, what are some temporary interruptions, and like how do you tell the difference between a temporary and a permanent interruption or change to your programming? Can be kind of hard at times, but there are some things that we believe are just temporary. So for us, for example, is the no outcomes data. There wasn't year-end testing, there wasn't a lot of data collected at the end of the year, but we just don't anticipate that going forward, right? And so being able to explain that this is temporary compared to like, here's permanent changes that we've decided to make, or here's change. John Murphy sharing sustainability is key. So what has been learned, what has been shown to be effective, both in impact and improving access, and then like, then why are we making those changes permanent? Being able to kind of explain that whole cycle. Also, like explaining why there's missing data instead of just explaining that there is missing data. It's good to know why. Is it because like staff has just been too busy to do data collection? Or maybe there are kids that are now missing from your program, but really being able to explain the why. And in a lot of ways, that's because like that data story really is important to funders. It's another way to learn about the community as well as the needs that students and families are experiencing, and also gives a little bit more context to what's going on with the data. And as long as you're providing like, here's what happened, here's what we saw, here's what we learned, and then like, here's our plan going forward, that all makes it very easy to understand in reporting where the organization is coming from. Oops. And so I kind of rushed through that because I wanted to provide the opportunity for participants to ask questions and have them answered by folks from RAF United Way and Mayo. And so this is where I open up the floor for questions. I believe we have about 10-15 minutes, and we may not use up all of the time. That's totally fine, but I would love to hear from some other folks in the room.
Hi, this is John Murphy from Mayo. One of the things that we're starting to see in some of the grant applications, and just anecdotal information too, is we're seeing a lot of burnout and fatigue, and just really having trouble sustaining, and like I mentioned before, sustainability financially, but also just continuing this way and at this pace. So I think if people can address that in their grants, their applications, I think that's a good thing.
John, are you talking about addressing how they are protecting against burnout, or?
Yeah,
Yeah.
both from the agency staff as well as for the participants, the clients.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for that observation. I think it's a sentiment that's being felt very widely, but being able to address that is not, I would not have considered that, I guess, as I was writing, but it's very much a factor in operations right now.
Work from home, learn from home, all seemed really cool 7 months ago when it was new. But now that it's the way it is, people are, you can just tell that they're wearing out, you know.
Something I would share, some observation as well, that I think has something I've seen pre-COVID, but and seeing I think a lot more now, is trying to understand if the purpose of the grant is to sustain your organization from the funder's perspective, or to create community impact from the funder's perspective. And so I'm seeing responses to questions on our grants that are about how does your program generate community impact? And the responses are about organizational need. Just making sure, as Kelsey said, like looking to that request for proposals and really trying to speak the language that reviewers are being primed to hear. Because our reviewers are taught to look for community impact, and when a program comes in and says, here's our organizational hole, we need you to fill it, it's not a very persuasive argument. And I think partly that's born out of the fact that we have CARES funds and things like that right now that are really about sustaining nonprofit businesses through this crisis, and that's really important. And with that burnout, lots of folks I think are transferring grant language from one place to the next, so making sure that you're speaking the language that's in that request for proposals.
Kelsey, is this this is the second session that you've held today?
Yep.
Were there any questions that came up in the first session that you think would be transferable? I'm curious, I missed the first session.
I've been in very much implementation mode and not remember mode, so I'm gonna scroll up a little bit.
Is this, are they in this chat box too? I didn't realize.
They're in mine, you know,
Oh.
because I was in the first one. So I think one thing that came up was for new agencies, how to be writing grant narrative if you are new. And so I talked a little bit about, because you don't have historical data, you don't have outcomes data, being able to have something like a logic model or theory of change to be able to say, like, here's the community need, here's the services that we provide, here's what we believe is the impact or will become the impact, and just being very like clear and able to pull that line through the entire narrative. And I believe, John, that's where you were supplying, like using plain language and being really explicit about how you are reaching underserved communities or communities who are facing the most barriers. So I don't know if that carries through to this group. That's where a lot of the conversation had landed, was developing grant narrative for something that's entirely new. And I mean, right now it might be a new program or an entirely new agency, because there is so much response to different community needs that may have been addressed by a certain agency before. You might be writing a proposal for an entirely new program. So that was the advice I think that was offered. I don't know if Jeremy or Emily or John had more to add to that. I was just providing a synopsis. I'm sorry.
That's really good. That is exactly what we talked about. The other thing too is, now we're kind of at that next generation. And so how is what you're doing going to allow people to return to work? That's really important too. So are you putting in place things that help people be able to get on with their lives? So those of you who are on the line here from the schools, you know, that's a big benefit of the schools, is allowing people to work. And so I'll let the group talk about that a little bit.
I'm sorry, John, I was distracted for a moment. You talked about return to office.
Right. Well, or even just being able to return to work.
Yes.
Even if it's from home, but return to the office. Just if you can demonstrate how you are contributing to client help, but also local, bigger picture help.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, too, like some of the interconnectedness, like how I was saying, there might be a need that your agency is addressing now with new work that maybe previously it hadn't considered, so that crossover from between employment and education, or between food, transportation. So yeah, being able to think of some of those, the secondary effects, like that's not health specifically, but it is impacting the community tremendously, and almost more so as the pandemic becomes sustained or goes on for longer. So I think being able to locate yourself in the broader community picture in general is really good in trying to compose a narrative.
Response to COVID-19 and helping to stabilize the local economy.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
One of the other questions that came up, to answer your question, Jerome, in the first session was about, are more funders moving toward unrestricted awards or staff or overhead costs? So we talked a little bit about that.
And what was the conclusion?
That I think in general there is, like I know I'm seeing a lot in sort of funders communities online about the need is more urgent than ever to make sure we're covering those mission critical costs like staffing. And Jeremy pointed out that there are some restrictions for an organization like REF with their endowments. United Way of Olmsted County funding is program specific but unrestricted within program budget, so covers program staffing.
Yeah, and this is Jeremy. I also kind of pointed out that, we know what's happening right now, but none of us can predict the future. And with some of this funding potentially running out in 2021, the impact could actually be greater next year than it was this year, especially if the pandemic continues and the government can't, keep creating trillion-dollar or multi-trillion-dollar bills. There's the potential for more breakdown there with that need.
That's right.
I agree, Jeremy. Oh, sorry, Drew.
Oh, go ahead, Jackie.
This is
Great to
Jackie.
hear you. Yes.
Yes, I've been very silent today. I just really kind of have been attending and really attended to absorb and take it all in. But I agree, Jeremy, that our Center Civic League, the nursery, has been the recipient of several of the rounds of the Child Care Aware grants, and now more recently, just today, is the health support funds that are available for the child care centers. We were so fortunate to remain open completely throughout the entire, well, we're still in COVID, but obviously that kind of critical first 3-4 months where we were all kind of wondering what to do, and really provided this essential service, right, to so many people who needed us, especially like the tier 1 emergency workers and hospital workers, doctors and nurses. But then as people got back into the workforce and there were soft reopens here and there, we also found such an influx of people who had maybe previously not been on any tuition assistance or whatever from previously in our program, and then saying, we weren't able to work for 3 months and now we're back and we need childcare still. Can you help us? So these are those extra funds certainly helped us. But again, like Jeremy said, the sustainability of, like, those funds aren't always going to be there, next year and possibly going forward. Our revenue now is down. We're down approximately 20 students. So out of 81, we have 61 back. And then just talking about the grants and so forth and the data reporting, the number or percentage for us, we like to report on the number or percentage of children is achieving developmental milestones. And we did that, of course, fall of 19, because that was our first checkpoint. And then we needed to do it again spring of 20. I mean, we just simply had no children I shouldn't say no children, but there were so few children to report on or assess because they weren't there. We went from a center of 80 till at our lowest was a center of 8. And then we went up to 10 and 12 and 15, 30 was a huge week. We're like, okay, we're coming back. So yeah, it's been tough. And, but this has been just really informative. About in writing new grants. And I wish I would have been to this session before I pressed submit last week for my United Way grant. because an outcome obviously of caring for children in an exceptional educational environment, right, is, how does that impact our community? Because children that have this educational experience and exceptional and high quality childcare, and their parents are able to work and have an income into that household, and the children are ready for kindergarten, well, we know just the snowball, the ripple effect, exactly what Cradle to Career is all about. And that is, everything from, they're reading earlier and test scores are higher, and but it comes, you know, crime rate is lower, and just the instances of children receiving this quality care impacts them the rest of their life. For a woman of few words who started this day, I haven't really spoken since 1 o'clock. I said a little spiel there, but yeah, so thank you.
Congratulations, Jackie. It's great to hear that you're back up. Your numbers are climbing. That's a testament to your staff and to the practices you have in place and being able to sustain that.
Yes, absolutely.
It's incredible. It's a great accomplishment. And, you know, it made me think too, as you were speaking about the experiences of funders in the community through the crisis. I think we've garnered some experiences that we have yet to realize the full implications from, and that probably will play out over time in the future. But the Together Fund and the marrying up of funds in advance of funding collaboratively, I think there were some lessons learned through that process that could potentially affect our community going forward in a positive way. And then in our distance learning RFP right now, we've got a little bit different form of collaboration that's happening on the back end. So the RFPs, the requests that are being submitted for distance learning, we're opening up our review team to include other potential sources of funding, CARES funding in particular, which expire at the end of the year, to try to utilize those dollars towards certain line items in the RFPs. So I just think as a community of funders, there are some experiences to the COVID-19 crisis that could also affect narratives going forward, right? That we're not writing for multiple, it's potentially streamlining the application process. Who knows where it will go. I see we're getting a call